The shovel sliced through the earth with a muted thud, damp soil clinging to the metal like secrets refusing to be unearthed. Sweat beaded on Carlos's brow, the morning sun still low but already unkind. He straightened his back slowly, glancing toward the towering mansion behind him. A ghost of colonial grandeur, ivory walls veined with ivy, and windows that watched like eyes that never blinked. He hated those windows. They reminded him of where he stood in this world. Outside, beneath, below. Just a shadow in the garden. Carlos was a gardener. A black man working for a rich white widow in a town where no one remembered your name, only your role. He trimmed hedges, pulled weeds, and kept his head down. Boys. But there was something about this garden. Something buried deeper than roots. That morning he had wandered into a part of the estate no one touched anymore. The East Grove, choked by overgrown vines and the smell of damp rot. He had passed it 100 times, always told not to waste time there. But something, a sound, a feeling, a whisper in the air had drawn him in. It was beneath a twisted old magnolia that he found it. While digging out a stubborn root, his shovel struck something solid. Not rock. Not wood. Metal. Carlos crouched, brushing the dirt away with trembling fingers. A ring. Oh, not just any ring. Thick gold, ancient. Its center housed a deep red gemstone, like a frozen drop of blood. Strange symbols were etched along its inner band, almost worn away with time. He turned it in his palm, the weight of it unnatural, wrong somehow, as if it belonged to another life. Another story. His heart pounded. Not from fear. Not yet, but from the echo of possibility. This ring was worth something. Maybe everything. Maybe enough to leave. Enough to live. Then a shadow passed over him. He snapped his head up, but the grove was empty. And yet he felt it, that icy slither down his spine. The garden was watching. Carlos slid the ring into his pocket slowly, carefully. He would tell no one. Not yet. Not until he knew what it was. What it meant. Behind him, far up the hill, a curtain in the second-story window of the manor shifted ever so slightly. Mildred Grace was watching. And she knew. The next morning the sun rose like an executioner, bright, pitiless, indifferent. Carlos was already on his knees, yanking weeds from between the stones that led to the greenhouse. His fingers ached from the day before, but it wasn't the pain that consumed his thoughts. It was the ring. Wrapped in an old handkerchief and hidden behind the shed, in a crack he'd found years ago and never spoken of, the ring burned in his mind like a secret sin. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Not just the weight of it or the strange symbols that seemed older than the soil itself, but what it represented. Possibility. Boy, came the voice behind him, sharp and brittle like cold glass. Carlos stiffened. Only one person called him that. Mildred Grace stood on the terrace in a long silk robe, her gray hair wound tight into a bun, her skin pale and dry like parchment. In her hand was a porcelain teacup, though she didn't sip from it. She never did. It was just something to hold. Something to show that she held everything. You missed a spot, she said, pointing with her toe to a clump of dandelions. Carlos nodded silently and leaned forward, reaching for the weeds. Funny, she said softly. You were in the East Grove yesterday, weren't you? His hand froze in midair. I told you before, she went on, not looking at him, that part of the property is off limits. But I suppose you people always think rules are just suggestions. Her voice wasn't angry. That's what made it worse. It was calm. Controlled. The tone of someone who knew the power she held and enjoyed wielding it. I was just clearing brush, ma'am, Carlos said carefully, his eyes on the ground. Of course you were, she said, smiling. Still, things tend to go missing when the help starts poking around where they don't belong. Carlos felt something twist in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Rage. But it was a quiet, buried thing. Like him. I hope you understand, she added, stepping closer, her slippers whispering on the stone. You people don't really steal things, but sometimes, you forget what doesn't belong to you. She reached down, plucked a weed he had missed and dropped it on his hand. Then she turned and walked back inside. Carlos stared after her for a long time. The weed still sat on his hand like an accusation. The ring burned in his memory, heavier than gold. The game had begun. The house had changed. It no longer just stood, it breathed. It watched. Carlos felt it with every step across the dew-covered grass. The air was heavier now, sticky like syrup. Shadows clung to corners that once felt safe. Even the mirror seemed to reflect something else. Not his face but his fear. Mildred Grace had entered a new phase of her game. She no longer gave commands, she gave tests. Polish the brass handles again, would you? I believe you missed something yesterday. Why don't you clean the attic today? I haven't sent anyone up there in years. Could you replant all the roses? They look unsettled. Unsettled. Every task came with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Every order dripped with subtext. I know. I'm watching. You're not as clever as you think. Carlos obeyed. He had no choice. The ring remained hidden behind the shed, wrapped in cloth and gilt. But Mildred was circling like a hawk sensing blood beneath the soil. She began to speak to him differently. Not just as a servant, but as a thing. You people never quite understand boundaries, she murmured once, watching him mop the marble hallway. Do you know what discipline meant in my father's time? Not these soft little warnings. Real consequences. Another time she passed him in the dining room and whispered, I can smell lies, Carlos. They linger like sweat. Every sentence was a needle. Every smile was a threat with perfume on it. One evening, as the sun bled over the estate, she called him to her study. The walls were lined with old books, leather-bound and rotting, and a single photograph of a man in military uniform. Her father, perhaps, or her late husband. Carlos stood straight, eyes down. She didn't look up from her writing. Tell me, Carlos, she said, voice flat. Have you ever stolen anything in your life? He didn't answer at first. She looked up slowly. Be honest. You people say it's because you're hungry. Or angry. Or poor. But sometimes I think you just enjoy taking things that don't belong to you. It's cultural, no? Carlos clenched his jaw. His fists remained at his sides, but his nails bit into his palms. I haven't stolen anything, ma'am. She stared at him a moment longer, then gave a thin smile. Of course not. You're one of the good ones. He left the study shaking. Not from fear. From fury. But he swallowed it like he always did. That night, as he lay in the narrow cot in the servants' quarters, he couldn't sleep. The walls pressed in closer. The house listened. He knew she was getting closer. He could feel it. The guilt. The secret. And somewhere in the dark, the ring seemed to pulse like a heart. Let's take a brief pause. If you're still listening, we'd love to know. Where are you tuning in from? Have you ever experienced anything even remotely close to what Carlos is going through? Power games, injustice, being accused without a voice? Share your story in the comments. And if this story speaks to you, if it grabs you even a little, consider subscribing. There's much more to come, and it only gets darker from here. How we continue. The air in the house was stifling, thick with a tension that pressed down on Carlos's chest with each passing moment. He knew it was coming. The way she had been looking at him lately, the subtle but sharp comments she made, it was clear she was watching him, waiting for something. But he never imagined she'd strike so quickly. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, just as the sun cast long shadows across the garden. Carlos was in the kitchen, washing the dishes, his hands submerged in soapy water, when he heard the familiar click of her heels on the marble floor. He didn't look up. He didn't have to. Mildred Grace stood in the doorway, her posture straight and stiff, her eyes cold, calculating. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there as though savoring the moment, enjoying the discomfort she was about to cause. Carlos, she said finally, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I've been thinking. That ring, the one you found in the garden. His heart skipped a beat. He froze, the dish in his hands forgotten. The ring. He knew. I believe it was mine, she continued, her voice dripping with false sincerity. I lost it years ago. It's very valuable, you know. A family heirloom. He paused, letting the words sink in. I think you found it, didn't you? Carlos could feel the heat rise in his chest, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. But he kept his face impassive, his body still. I didn't take it, ma'am, he said, his voice steady, though his insides twisted with anxiety. I found it, yes, but I didn't take it. I didn't even know whose it was. She tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You expect me to believe that? She asked, her tone mocking. Do you think I'm a fool, Carlos? You of all people stealing from me? From us. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Do you think I wouldn't notice? Carlos's mind raced, but he remained silent. She was playing with him, twisting the truth until it became nothing but a cruel game. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, the words feeling hollow in his throat. "I swear to you I didn't take it." Mildred's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold contempt. "Well, I think it's time the other servants know about your little theft," she said casually, as if she were discussing the weather. "You can't just go around taking things from the people who pay you. It's disgraceful, don't you think?" Before Carlos could respond, she turned on her heel and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The next few hours were a blur of whispers, glances, and uncomfortable silences. Mildred's words had spread quickly. The other servants looked at him differently now, with suspicion, with doubt. No one said anything directly, but the cold stares were enough to make him feel like an animal in a cage. He had always been the help to them, but now he was that help, the one who couldn't be trusted. He tried to continue his work, but every movement, every glance felt scrutinized. The weight of the accusation pressed down on him with each passing second. He could feel the eyes of the house on him, like silent judges ready to condemn him without a word. When he finally made his way to the servants' quarters that evening, it was as though the walls themselves were closing in around him. He could hear the muttered conversations through the thin walls, the hushed tones that dropped when he passed by. He wasn't welcome anymore. He wasn't even human to them anymore. He was a thief. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning. Mildred had succeeded. She had turned the house against him just as he knew she would. But what did she want? What was her endgame? His stomach churned as he realized just how fragile his existence was in that house. One accusation. One lie. And his life had been flipped upside down. He was nothing. A man at the mercy of a woman who wielded her power like a weapon. Carlos knew he had to act. He had to find a way to clear his name, to show them all the truth. But the walls were closing in, and the truth had never seemed so far away. The game had changed, and Carlos was no longer the one calling the shots. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last, like an unending weight pressing on Carlos's chest. The house had become a prison, its walls thick with the suffocating tension that Mildred had woven into every moment. She knew exactly how to play him, how to twist the knife just deep enough to make him bleed but never enough to die. Her words were sharp, cruel, and they were everywhere. She had started with small things. A dismissive comment when he passed by, the cold silence when he answered a question. At first, Carlos thought it might just be his imagination, that perhaps he was being too sensitive, too aware of his place. But as the days passed, he realized it wasn't his imagination. It was a game she had already won, and now she was simply waiting to see how long he would last. Each morning, Mildred made sure to greet him with a look of disdain, as if she had already judged him guilty. Her smile, tight and practiced, never reached her eyes. She would call him for the most insignificant tasks, knowing that every time he answered, he would feel the weight of her expectations bearing down on him. "I need you to clean the kitchen again, Carlos. You missed a spot last time. Go fetch the mail from the front gate. We can't trust you with anything else, can we?" She even made sure to speak louder when the other servants were nearby, as if to remind them of their place, of the hierarchy they all knew so well. Carlos's skin crawled whenever he saw her approach. But he couldn't escape. Not in the house, not in the garden. It was as if she had stretched her power over every inch of the estate, and he was trapped in her web. And then came the threats. "I'm sure the authorities would love to hear about a theft happening under my roof," Mildred said one evening, her voice laced with venom. "You wouldn't want to bring attention to this, would you, Carlos? I'm sure you wouldn't want your name dragged through the mud." Carlos felt a cold sweat form on his back. He had seen it happen to others before. People who had tried to stand up for themselves, people who had dared to defy the system. They were fired without a second thought. Their reputations destroyed in an instant. It was easy to crush someone who had no power. But Mildred wasn't just threatening his job. She was threatening his entire existence. She knew that, as a black man, Carlos's position in the world was already fragile. She knew that the world would listen to her over him, that the law would favor her over someone like him. She knew that the weight of a false accusation would be enough to ruin him. And she was willing to use that knowledge to keep him in line. "You should be grateful, Carlos," she continued one day, her voice cold and mocking. "Not everyone gets to be employed by someone like me. People like you, you're lucky you even have a roof over your head." Don't forget that. Her words were like poison, each one slowly eroding his sense of self. The shame crept in. The feeling of being less than, the feeling that no matter what he did he would always be nothing in her eyes. She had reduced him to an object, something to be used, something to be thrown away when no longer needed. The other servants, once his colleagues, now treated him with quiet contempt. They watched from the corners of their eyes, speaking in hushed tones when he passed, pretending not to notice as Mildred continued to pick him apart piece by piece. "Carlos," Mildred would say, "you are a reminder of how easy it is to lose everything." Her gaze was cold, calculating, and every time she looked at him he felt smaller, less significant. Her manipulation became more insidious. She would push him to the edge, then pull back just enough to make him question himself, to make him wonder if he was truly in the wrong. He began to second-guess everything. His every movement felt wrong. Every word he spoke seemed to echo with uncertainty. It was as if she had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, and it had begun to grow, feeding off the constant pressure she applied. "I know how you people are," Mildred said one day, her tone dripping with condescension. "You can't help yourselves. It's in your nature to take what doesn't belong to you." Carlos's blood ran cold. "How you people," the words burned into him. It wasn't just an accusation anymore. It was an attack on his very being. She wasn't just calling him a thief. She was calling him less than human. Every night, Carlos lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the house settling, the whispers of the servants in the hall. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was being crushed from all sides, that every breath he took was one breath closer to breaking under the weight of it all. And yet, in the darkest corners of his mind, a small spark remained. A part of him that refused to die, that refused to believe he was nothing more than what she said he was. It was small, fragile, but it was there. And with every word she threw at him, every insult, it began to burn a little brighter. He would not be her victim forever. Carlos couldn't breathe. Every day under the weight of Mildred's words, every passing hour in the suffocating silence of the house, he felt his mind unraveling just a little more. She was winning. Slowly but surely he was losing the battle. But the ring, the one thing that remained his secret, haunted him. It wasn't just about the truth of who it belonged to. It was more than that. It was about something deeper. Something darker. The more Mildred twisted the knife in his back, the more Carlos knew he had to find the truth. He couldn't sit in that house and wait for her to destroy him. He had to act. He had to dig deeper into the past that Mildred never spoke of, the past that she desperately tried to bury. One evening, after the house had quieted and Mildred had retired to her study, Carlos slipped out of the servants' quarters, making sure the other servants were preoccupied with their own tasks. He went to the village, the one place that seemed to hold secrets, the place where people still remembered things about the Grace family that weren't mentioned in the history books or the mansion's carefully curated stories. He found an old man named Tomas, a former groundskeeper who had worked for the family decades ago. Tomas was sitting outside his small cottage, tending to his garden, his hands rough and weathered from years of hard labor. Carlos approached him cautiously, unsure of what to expect but desperate for answers. "Excuse me, sir," Carlos began, his voice low. "I'm trying to learn more about the history of the Grace family, about the house. I found something and I need to know more." Tomas didn't look up immediately, but Carlos could feel the man's gaze shift toward him, as if he knew what was coming. "Grace family history?" Tomas muttered, a dry laugh escaping his lips. "You better be careful with that. The Graces are good at making people forget, especially things they don't want anyone to remember." Carlos swallowed hard, but his determination pushed him forward. "I found something, a ring," he said. "I think it belonged to someone from their family, someone who disappeared. Do you know anything about it?" Tomas paused, his hands freezing mid-motion. His eyes flicked to the side, a shadow of hesitation in his gaze. Then slowly he stood up, his old bones creaking. "You've found that cursed thing, haven't you?" Tomas said, his voice low. "The ring belonged to Jonathan Grace. He was different, you see. He was supposed to inherit everything, the house, the land, the wealth. But he disappeared. Just like that. Vanished into thin air and no one ever knew why." Carlos's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the name, of course. Jonathan Grace was a part of the family history, the brother of Mildred's father, the one who had been groomed to take over the estate. But Carlos had never heard about his disappearance in the stories Mildred told. What happened to him? Carlos asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tomas's face darkened. Jonathan had been troubled. He didn't fit into their world. They didn't like the way he thought. He started asking too many questions, questioning things that shouldn't be questioned. Things about the land, the people who worked it, and the way they were treated. Tomas paused, his voice becoming thick with bitterness. You see, the Grace family doesn't just own land. They own lives. They've always used the people who work for them. And Jonathan, he started seeing that. He tried to do something about it. Tried to change things. But change wasn't in their blood. Carlos felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just about the ring. This was something bigger, something more dangerous. So they killed him? Carlos asked, his voice trembling. Tomas looked at him, his eyes cold. They didn't have to kill him. They just made him disappear. Discredited him, destroyed his reputation. The rest of the family carried on like nothing ever happened. And Jonathan was erased. Just another name forgotten. Carlos's mind reeled. He had thought the ring might be a simple family heirloom, something with sentimental value, but now he understood. The ring wasn't just a symbol of wealth or inheritance. It was a symbol of something much darker. It was a reminder of the family's history of manipulation, exploitation, and violence. Violence not only toward the people who worked the land, but toward anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Mildred wasn't just trying to intimidate him. She was trying to protect the family legacy, the legacy that had been built on the suffering of others. The truth was ugly, and it was more than he could handle. But Carlos couldn't ignore it. He couldn't turn away from it anymore. As he walked back to the mansion, the weight of what he had learned pressed down on him. Mildred Grace was more dangerous than he had realized. But the truth was even more dangerous. The ring wasn't just a key to the family's past. It was a key to their future, and it could either be his salvation or his destruction. He didn't know which one it would be. Carlos had always known the house was full of secrets, but now, it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The air was thick, heavy with the unspoken tension that had wrapped itself around his life like a noose. Every day felt like a delicate balancing act, where one misstep could cost him everything. The ring, hidden away like an anchor to the past, was the key. Carlos couldn't bring himself to just hand it over to Mildred, no matter how hard she pushed. He needed to understand its significance, its history. He couldn't let her twist the truth any longer. He couldn't let her use him like this. She was more dangerous than he had imagined, and she was playing a game with him that he didn't fully understand. But the more he dug, the more complicated things became. He began to seek out people who knew the Grace family. Old acquaintances, distant relatives, anyone who might have information. Late at night, after his chores were done, he would slip away from the house, pretending to go for walks in the garden but instead making his way to the small village where the older generations lived. He talked to anyone willing to listen, even if it meant risking his reputation further. One evening, after a long and fruitless conversation with an elderly widow who claimed to remember Jonathan Grace, Carlos returned to the servants' quarters feeling defeated. But then he noticed something. A slip of paper, torn and crumpled, hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. He unfolded it carefully, his heart racing. The paper was an old letter written in a hurried hand, with phrases that made Carlos's blood run cold. Jonathan knew too much. They can't let him speak. He was getting too close to the truth. There's nothing more dangerous than a man who sees through the veil. The letter was dated just days before Jonathan's disappearance. The handwriting was unrecognizable, but the message was clear. Jonathan had been close to discovering something the family didn't want known. And Mildred's father, it seemed, had been part of it. Carlos was more determined than ever. But with that determination came risk. As he continued to gather more pieces of the puzzle, the pressure inside the house mounted. The eyes of the other servants, once indifferent, now followed him wherever he went. The whispers grew louder. He could hear them when he passed the kitchen, see the way they glanced at him from the corners of their eyes. The other servants no longer looked at him like a colleague. Now he was the thief in their eyes, the one who had stolen from the Grace family, the one who could never be trusted. Mildred's behavior was even more pointed. She'd started making public, cruel remarks, ensuring that everyone heard her accusations. Every time she passed him, there was a venomous edge to her voice. "You're lucky to still be here, Carlos," she'd say, loud enough for the others to hear. "If I were in charge, I'd have thrown you out by now. But I'm generous." Her words stung like a whip, each one reminding him of his place. Beneath her, beneath them all. She wasn't just trying to ruin him. She was making an example of him, showing the others that anyone who didn't comply, anyone who dared to ask questions, could easily be cast aside. She was pushing him to the edge, hoping he would break, hoping he would give in. But Carlos didn't break. He pushed back. He continued to search for answers. He managed to secretly write letters to people who had worked with the Grace family years ago, carefully wording his questions so as not to draw attention. He knew that if Mildred ever found out what he was doing, it would be the end of him. But the more he uncovered, the more he realized how deep the roots of the Grace family's corruption ran. It wasn't just Jonathan. It was the entire legacy. A legacy built on lies, manipulation, and the exploitation of the people who worked for them. And Carlos, despite everything, could still feel the weight of his decision. He was taking risks every time he spoke to someone, every time he went behind Mildred's back. One wrong move, one slip of the tongue, and he could find himself at the mercy of the law. He knew how easily she could destroy him. How easily she could make the authorities believe her version of the story, that he was nothing more than a thief trying to steal from the family. But the truth was too important. He couldn't back down now. One night, as he sat in the small room where he slept, reading through old letters and documents he had managed to gather, he heard footsteps approaching the servants' quarters. He quickly shoved the papers under the mattress and held his breath, listening intently. The door creaked open and a figure stepped inside. It was Mildred. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carlos," she said, her voice low and mocking. He turned to face her, his heart racing. He couldn't back down now. "I'm not playing any games, Mrs. Grace," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm looking for the truth. And I'll find it no matter what." Mildred's smile widened, but there was nothing kind about it. "You think you can outsmart me? You think you can beat me at my own game?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll learn, Carlos. You'll learn that people like you never win. No matter how much you try, you'll always lose." With that, she turned and left, the door slamming shut behind her. Carlos sat there, the words echoing in his mind. But he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had nothing to lose. The tension in the house had reached its peak. Carlos could feel it in the air, thick, suffocating. Every glance from the other servants was now laced with suspicion. Mildred's accusations had spread like wildfire, and he had become the target of their disdain. But he couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything he had uncovered. He had to prove he wasn't the thief, that the ring didn't belong to Mildred, that he wasn't the monster she had painted him to be. The plan was simple. Return the ring to the place where he had found it in the East Grove, and show them all that it belonged to the garden. That it was just a forgotten artifact of the past, not the priceless family heirloom Mildred claimed it was. He could already hear the accusations fading, the eyes turning away from him as if his actions could erase all the lies. Carlos waited for the night to fall, his pulse quickening with every passing minute. He had hidden the ring deep inside his coat pocket, wrapped in the same cloth where he had concealed it before. As the house quieted, he slipped out of his quarters, careful to avoid the watchful eyes of the others. The garden was dark, only the distant lights of the mansion faintly illuminating the path. The East Grove was silent, the air thick with the scent of earth and overgrown vines. Carlos knelt down in the exact spot where he had found the ring, hesitated for a moment, and then, with a deep breath, placed the ring carefully back into the soil. He stepped back, a sense of relief washing over him. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if everything would be all right. The past would be buried where it belonged. But just as he turned to leave, a voice called out to him from the darkness. "You really think this will fix everything?" Carlos froze. Mildred emerged from the shadows, her figure tall and imposing, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of contempt and something else, something darker. She had been waiting for him. She had known. And now she was here to confront him. Carlos's heart pounded in his chest. He had hoped this moment would bring clarity, but instead, it felt like the end of something much more dangerous. "I didn't steal it," Carlos said, his voice shaking with the weight of his own uncertainty. "I found it. It belongs here in the garden." Mildred stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the ground, echoing like a death sentence. "You think I don't know that?" she asked, her voice low and chilling. "You think this ring is just about a simple theft?" She laughed, a dry, mocking sound. You're too naive, Carlos. You don't understand anything about what's happening here. Carlos swallowed hard, the unease creeping up his spine. What do you mean? Mildred's eyes softened for just a moment. A brief flicker of something painful, something human. Then like a switch she turned cold again. This ring, it's not just a piece of jewelry. It belonged to my son. Carlos blinked in confusion. Your son? Mildred nodded, her gaze distant. Yes. Jonathan Grace's son. The one who died. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying a sorrow she had clearly hidden for years. You found the ring in the garden, didn't you? My son used to play there. It was his favorite spot. Carlos stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in like a stone in his gut. He was just a boy, she continued, her voice breaking. A boy who was taken from me. And now you've come here to unearth the past. To drag up the old wounds that have never healed. She looked at him with something like pity, but it was quickly replaced by a flicker of anger. You've revived all the pain, all the memories I've spent years trying to bury. Carlos's mind reeled. He had thought that returning the ring would make everything right, that it would clear his name, and yet here he was, caught in the middle of a tragedy he hadn't even known existed. The ring was not just a symbol of the Grace family's wealth and power. It was a symbol of loss, of a mother's pain. He had never considered the depth of what the ring represented to her. To Mildred. You don't understand, do you? She whispered, her voice sharp now. This ring is not about you. It's about everything that was taken from me. And now you're making it worse. Carlos took a step back, his mind spinning. The guilt that had been festering within him suddenly shifted. It wasn't about the ring being a tool for Mildred's manipulation anymore. It wasn't just about proving himself innocent. It was about understanding what he had unknowingly resurrected. He had unknowingly ripped open old wounds, and he had done it because he didn't understand the full weight of the situation. I never meant to hurt you, Carlos said, his voice barely audible. I only wanted to clear my name. Mildred's eyes softened for a moment, but then she wiped her eyes and sneered at him. You never did understand your place, did you? You think you're entitled to anything more than what I give you. You people always think you can take what you want without understanding the consequences. Carlos flinched at her words, the sting of her racism cutting through him like a blade. His entire existence reduced to nothing more than a pawn in her game. He could feel the weight of the generations of injustice, exploitation, and violence pressing on him, crushing him under the weight of her contempt. Mildred's face twisted into a cold smile, her eyes gleaming with a triumphant cruelty. Now you understand. But it's too late. It's always too late for people like you. The ring, once a symbol of wealth, now felt like a curse. Carlos realized he had never truly understood the magnitude of the family's dark history, how far it reached, how deeply it had scarred not only those who worked for them, but even those within the family itself. And now, with this revelation, he could see that Mildred wasn't just a victim of loss. She was a product of it. A woman broken by the past, using her power to keep the cycle of pain alive. And Carlos, caught in the crossfire, had only just begun to understand the full extent of the game he was playing. Carlos felt like the world was closing in on him. The walls of the house, once familiar and almost comforting, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint murmur from the other servants, every cold glance from Mildred, was a reminder that his life, the one he had carefully built in his mind, was falling apart. It all began with the sudden appearance of Mildred at the end of the long hallway, standing before the other servants in the main hall, her face like stone, her eyes sharp and accusing. The moment Carlos saw her, he knew. He could feel the storm brewing. Her movements were deliberate, calculated, and she knew she had already won. He had been nothing more than a pawn in her game, and now the final move was being made. Gather around, everyone, Mildred called out to the staff, her voice cold and dismissive. It seems we have a thief in our midst. Someone who has been stealing from this family. Carlos's heart dropped into his stomach, his blood running cold. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, could see the others slowly turning to look at him with a mixture of suspicion and fear. You all know Carlos, she continued, her voice rising, the one who's been here for so long pretending to be loyal. But now we know the truth. He's been stealing from us. The servants stared at him in silence, some with raised eyebrows, others with shock on their faces. Mildred's accusations cut through the air like a blade. Carlos wanted to speak, to protest, but his throat tightened with the overwhelming knowledge that no one would listen. Not now. Not after everything she had said. Not after everything she had made them believe. Mildred continued, her words like daggers. He found something valuable in the garden, the heirloom ring that belonged to my family. And instead of being honest, he decided to keep it for himself. He's been hiding it, lying to all of us, and now we know he's a thief. The murmurs from the other servants grew louder. Is it true? One of them whispered. I didn't think he was that kind of person. Carlos's chest tightened. He could feel the blood rush to his face, the humiliation, the sting of being completely powerless. But it was worse than that. The racism that had always been just beneath the surface now bubbled to the top, and he knew that they saw him only as the other. The one who didn't belong, no matter how long he had worked here, no matter how much he had done for this house. Mrs. Grace, please, Carlos began, his voice hoarse. I didn't steal anything. I found the ring. It belongs in the garden. You're making a mistake. But his words fell on deaf ears. Mildred didn't even look at him. She stood there with the same cold expression, as if his life meant nothing more than a passing inconvenience. No, Carlos, she said, her voice cutting through the room. You are the mistake. You were never meant to be here, never meant to have anything. You don't belong in this house. You don't belong with us. The words struck him harder than any physical blow. The racism, the hate, the way she saw him as less than human. It wasn't just the accusation of theft. It was the years of oppression, of being seen as inferior. His whole life had been a battle against people like her, and now, despite all his effort, all his work, he was reduced to nothing. The house, once a place where he felt some semblance of belonging, now seemed like a tomb. Mildred turned to the other servants. I want him out of this house immediately. He will no longer work here. He will be reported to the authorities. He's nothing but a common thief, and I will not allow such people in my home. The words felt like a death sentence. Carlos's legs wobbled beneath him, but he remained standing, his head held high, even as the weight of his situation crushed him. The other servants stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Some of them, who had once been friendly, now looked at him with nothing but disdain, as if they had known all along he was nothing but trouble. It didn't matter that he had been loyal. It didn't matter that he had worked harder than any of them. In their eyes, he was a black man, a servant, and that meant he had no right to claim anything for himself. You're lucky I'm even allowing you to leave with your dignity intact, Mildred sneered. If it were up to me, I'd have you thrown in jail. But I'm being generous. Her voice was venomous, dripping with contempt. Carlos stood there, a knot in his stomach. He knew what this meant. Mildred would make sure that everyone in the town would know about the theft, that his reputation would be destroyed. She had power that would destroy him in an instant. And no one would believe him. Not when she was the one with the money, the family name, the connections. He turned and walked out of the room, his heart heavy with the crushing weight of defeat. He passed the other servants without a word, their eyes following him, some full of judgment, others full of pity. He didn't care anymore. He didn't care about their looks, their whispers. He was beyond that. His life as he had known it was over. And yet, as he stepped into the cold night air, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. He had been trying to fight for something, for dignity, for justice. But in a world like this, no one wins. Not really. There's always someone with more power, more money, and they'll always find a way to crush you. Carlos understood now that the game wasn't about fairness. It never had been. It was about survival. And in the end, survival meant giving in to the system or being crushed by it. He had fought, but in the end the system had won. Carlos stood in the cold night, the bitter wind cutting through his clothes as he walked away from the estate that had both given him a living and taken everything from him. His footsteps echoed in the stillness of the dark road, a slow march into the unknown. The city was far and the village even farther. There was nothing ahead of him but the shadow of his own freedom. A freedom that felt both terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The streets he walked were unfamiliar. The world felt distant now, like it was out of reach, and yet for the first time in his life he felt a strange sense of lightness. He had lost everything, his job, his dignity, his reputation, but with that loss something else had emerged. A quiet, unexpected freedom. Carlos didn't know what he was supposed to feel. After everything that had happened, he expected the weight of failure, of defeat, to press down on him. He thought he would feel ashamed, broken. But instead there was a different feeling, an unsettling kind of peace. His burden had been lifted, not in the way he had hoped, but in a way he never anticipated. He had been cast aside, forced out of the very place that had tried to make him invisible. The estate, once his prison, was now behind him. The mansion, its towering walls, the cold smiles of the Grace family, they were all in the past now. His path lay ahead, and in the distance there was nothing but the unknown. Carlos could still feel the sting of their words, the racist insults, the accusations that had torn at his spirit. The way they saw him, as less than human, as an object to be used and discarded, still burned in his chest. But now he understood something he had never grasped before. He had been shackled not just by the Grace family's control, but by his own belief in their power over him. He had given them that power. But now it was gone. For the first time he was free, truly free. It wasn't the kind of freedom he had imagined. It wasn't a grand escape or a triumphant victory. But it was real all the same. No longer bound by the expectations of a family that saw him as nothing more than a servant, no longer part of a world that sought to keep him down, Carlos had taken the first steps toward his own life. He didn't know what would come next. The future was a fog, an uncertain blur of possibilities. But what he did know was that he would never again be the man he was before. He had broken free from the chains of Mildred's lies, and in doing so he had discovered something more profound than any victory, his own strength. Days passed. Carlos wandered through the outskirts of the village, working odd jobs, doing whatever he could to survive. The world was hard. His skin still bore the marks of the racism that had followed him for years, the slurs that cut deep, the looks of contempt he received from strangers. He had no home, no safety net, and yet he had something he never had before: his life, his autonomy. The bitterness of the past still clung to him, but the weight of it was no longer suffocating. The more time he spent away from the mansion, the more he realized the full scope of his own oppression. His life, in the eyes of people like Mildred, had never been his own. He had always been a tool, a means to an end. He had worked tirelessly to build a life in the shadows of those who would never see him as their equal. But now his life was his own, and that alone was a form of freedom. Mildred, in the meantime, had won in court. She had gotten what she wanted. His eviction, the end of his work, his reputation tarnished. The law had sided with her as it always did for people like her. She was the victor. But the victory felt hollow. The house that had once been her empire now stood empty of its significance. The servants were gone. The estate had become a cold, silent shell of what it once was. And in the end, Mildred's victory proved to be her curse. She was left with nothing but the ghosts of her past, and her son Jonathan, whose death and the loss of everything he represented had been the root of her power. The ring, the last vestige of her family's legacy, had been returned to the earth, its significance erased by Carlos's own defiance. The world she had fought so hard to preserve had crumbled around her, and all that remained was her solitude. Mildred had won in a world of appearances, but in truth she had lost everything that had once mattered. She stood alone, her power meaningless in the face of what she had lost, the things that couldn't be bought or controlled. Carlos, on the other hand, knew something that Mildred could never understand. The world had stripped him of everything: his job, his identity, his place in the world. But in the ashes of his destruction he had found something that Mildred could never take from him: his own spirit, his will to survive. And in that there was freedom. He walked forward, one step at a time, away from the shadows of the estate and into the unknown. The journey ahead was uncertain, and he didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in his life it didn't matter. He was free, and that was all that mattered. The story ends with a bittersweet resolution. Carlos, though battered and broken, had found a way to live in a world that could not break him. He understood now that no one truly wins in a system built on exploitation and lies. But in the end he had won the one battle that mattered: his own freedom.